All right, so this week's guest is Christopher Nguyen, CEO and co-founder of Aitomatic. Christopher, welcome back to the Data Exchange podcast.
Hey, thanks, Ben. Hey, do I get a jacket or something if it's like number 5?
All right.
What number is this?
I forget. So today we're going to talk about knowledge first systems, knowledge first AI systems, because we're also going to announce or describe a community gathering, a conference, a summit around knowledge first systems. But for our audience, Christopher, very briefly, what is, in your mind, a knowledge first AI system?
Well, in the broadest sense, it's any AI that leverages in a significant way human knowledge and domain knowledge, as opposed to just using purely data. And it's a well-known, well-understood problem, right? That for many applications, particularly industrial companies and so on, that there's not enough data, not enough labels for just pure machine learning. And so there's been a lot of effort, using human knowledge to augment data, to synthesize data, and so on. But increasingly, the industries that are involved are, people are saying, why don't we encode human knowledge directly? Not just in expert systems, of the past, but essentially, how do we use domain knowledge? How do we, do that at the data layer, but also at the algorithms layer, maybe at an ensemble layer as well, so that we can go to market sooner. Right, so that's, to me, that's knowledge first AI, but I do have a more future-oriented view of it as well.
So let me put you on the spot. So I invite you to give a keynote at a conference. I give you 3 to 5 slides to get people excited about knowledge first. So what are some of your kind of most prototypical examples to, I guess, examples would have two objectives. One is to kind of flesh out what you mean, and then secondly, to get people excited about knowledge first. So it doesn't have to be limited to what you and your company are doing, but more broad.
Right. Well, I think there's 2 very important views, which is how do we solve problems today for this $25 trillion industrial AI industry? And why do I say that? Because in our typical Silicon Valley world, a lot of it is data input, data output, and processing. So the problem doesn't seem to be as acute. But in the physical industry, avionics, automotive, manufacturing, and so on, the problem is very, very clear. Any one of us that has touched that, run into that problem very quickly. So it's an interesting $25 trillion challenge, and you can build very large companies going after these markets with some of these techniques. So that's sort of the current go-to-market perspective. But you're also quite aware of LLMs, right? It's just proliferating. It's not, in fact, we're very excited about today, and we talk about prompt engineering and so on. But I really believe that knowledge engineering or using knowledge to train machines is the future, leveraging these LLMs. The idea that we'll always be using raw data, right, to train machine learning models is a temporary aberration, if you will, right? We will always use data, but when machines start to understand, concept like circles and squares, we will be communicating with them and say, if you see 3 circles, then something is bad or something like that. So that's also under the umbrella of knowledge first, AI, as far as I'm concerned. So I think it's a vast opportunity that we should all care about.
And then in some domains, actually, I've noticed that in areas like robotics, for example, so there was several years ago, people got excited about reinforcement learning, and then more recently, kind of more realism around maybe reinforcement learning is great, but we have to combine it with other things that we already know, right? So
you could argue that you could say that reinforcement learning is one aspect of using human knowledge, at least where the environment, the simulation takes advantage of whatever we know about the physics of the environment, right?
And so then in your case, when you go out and tell people we're building a knowledge first AI system, at this point, how much I guess education and evangelization do you still need to do, or reassurance that, hey, we're not saying that machine learning is bad, but, and what's the but?
Who's the audience when you say when I talk?
So when you go out and talk to people about, let's say, prospective customers or just other other people in our community.
Those are two very distinct demographics, and I get completely, I would say, different responses. I would say with customers and prospects, it's as far as, it goes as far as they sell it back to me, right? Because they know the problem. I'm not talking about people that are saying, what do I do with AI? These are teams that have already tried.
So these are mainly people in the industrial manufacturing.
That's right.
Anything that touches the physical world, kind of.
Right. And of course, in the past, 5 years, they've been, trying to implement quote unquote AI and so on, and found that the tutorials, if you will, right, that coming out of Silicon Valley fall short of what they, need to bring a solution. Of course, they sort of blame themselves, right? I must be doing something wrong. But when the message is that you have domain expertise, or your customers, right, the users of some of these systems have domain expertise, and you can leverage that, you can take that and automate it and incorporate it into this, I'm going to use a broadest term, right? Automated intelligence, right? AI. If you can take advantage of that, they're very excited. And they say, I always knew that was valuable. I just didn't have a tool to do that with, right? So that's that audience. I use the shorthand Silicon Valley as a more broadly folks like us, right? If you take the larger perspective, we're actually quite part of the sphere of a Google or a Meta, Facebook, or a Twitter, and so on. We all, many of us grew up entirely in the digital age, right? I didn't, you didn't, but it's been that bubble for a very long time. So when you talk about using human knowledge, people immediately say, are you going back to expert systems? And I thought we were done with that, right? And expert systems, as you know, has its limitations, and it takes more explanations and say, no, there are modern architectures. Again, at the data layer, there are companies that are doing large companies that are doing data augmentation, unsupervised learning, and so on. But at the algorithmic layer, there are, for a very long time now, but these architectures of how to train a machine learning model using, for example, loss functions that are informed by physics, that are informed by human knowledge. That's just one example that in the last 5 years have not been necessary for us, if you will, right? But have become very, very necessary in order to build AI systems in the physical industries. So Silicon Valley needs a bit more evangelization or I would say discussion.
But, I think part of the, so when you talk about knowledge first to other people, like you say, they think about expert systems, and expert systems bring up, rules and handcrafted rules and things like that, which, there's nothing wrong with those necessarily, right?
That's right.
Look at all the self-driving cars companies. They have tons of.
Tesla would not be in business if there were not rules in those systems.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just that I think the main thing that you're trying to say is, look, we can still use machine learning, but why not help it with things we already know, right?
Right. But like I say, it's more than a shorthand. I'll give you one quick example, very easy to understand, right? You could build a rule-based system, right? Maybe painstakingly, whatever. You have to build a Boolean or fuzzy logic model. And then you can take that model as a teacher, and then you can immediately use that and synthesize data or augment data, but use that teacher to train a machine learning student, right? And then the question some people may ask, if you don't, say, well, if you're the teacher, why do you need to train a student? Well, actually, the teacher can fail quite catastrophically at the edges, right? Rules are very good in the domain that they are valid, but machine learning models tend to smooth things out. So the combination, and then you ensemble the student and the teacher together, you can have a model that is better than both. So that's just one of many possible architectures that companies like ours are applying to solve these modern industrial system problems.
So let's locate this knowledge first idea in the context of an area that's generating a lot of attention and excitement among primarily researchers to begin with, but now also industry people, which is this whole data-centric AI idea, which, by the way, one of my pet peeves is most of us practitioners are always data-centric, right? Because basically, most of the time we actually did.
Isn't that the point?
we did spend a lot of time doing data until the researchers kind of got excited about it. But so knowledge first versus data-centric, is that a either or can they cooperate?
I don't think it's versus at all. I think data-centric is a subset of knowledge first, in our lingo here anyway. If you think about data-centric, I think it was Andrew Ng who sort of popularized or coined the term. And if you look into the history of it, Andrew ran into the same problem that I'm talking about, right, in a manufacturing context, and was essentially unable to use sort of the little data that was available to do defect detections and so on. And I think he was trying to make the point that, okay, so if you have two teams within your company, and one team is saying, okay, I'm going to try to solve this with better algorithms, and the other team is saying, you know what, let's go and collect more data, or be more deliberate about collecting the right data, or cleaning up the data set, essentially solve the 1 hour you spend on the data side turns out to yield a lot more marginal results, incremental results than the 1 hour you spend on algorithm. I think that's the point of data-centric, but you're absolutely right. Otherwise, what's the point? What's new here? I mean, machine learning has always been about data.
But as you describe it, basically the time you're spending on the data is basically time you are encoding your knowledge.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. You do data augmentation, even something as basic as, taking an image and rotating it and so on. And that's using some knowledge. But to be fair, that's too broad. But you can also decide using human, let's talk about domain knowledge in particular, not just, generic knowledge. You can decide exactly and say, this data set is good for this model, and this other data set is good for this model. I'm not going to try to build one for both. I'm just going to optimize for what I need to do.
And
this is very
straightforward.
Yep.
And what you're describing there is orthogonal to whether or not you're doing supervised or unsupervised, right? So obviously,
that's exactly right.
Obviously, in the supervised realm, you're having labels, so that encodes knowledge. But in the unsupervised realm, as you describe, what data should I use to begin with? That you're already making some decisions there. So in particular, for example, some of these self-supervised models that we're seeing now, like large language models or stable diffusion, if you just blindly feed it any kind of data, then it might spit out toxic output, right? So that's why OpenAI has a whole group just figuring out what data should we feed and what kind of toxicity reduction
I think
things should we use on the back end, right? So
right, it's interesting you bring that up, and I want to return to the knowledge first, but all of this actually does touch on a lot of AI ethics, or responsible AI, right? And that's, you think of it under the knowledge umbrella as well. You're using human knowledge. I like to say, machine learning, ultimately the system that we're building is really, we got to think about the world as we want it to be, right? Not the world as it is, because the world as it is can be quite toxic, can be quite bad, right? And you can't just say, my job is just to stick the data in and then whatever the model says. We've seen examples of that, and it's been quite disastrous, right? So now, for example, the DALL-E, the OpenAI playground. They're careful. You can't upload your photo and say, do something with it. No, we're gonna deal with real human faces. It's too dangerous.
So by the way,
touch it.
let me ask you about the phrase human knowledge first.
Mhm.
You could have said knowledge infused or knowledge enhanced, or
Right.
what's behind the phrase knowledge first?
Right. That's a great question because so far we've been giving a sort of a broad touch on it, but a lot of time when you say broad, you're actually not saying anything. Of course, there's knowledge, right? Of course, there's knowledge. But so knowledge first is intended to say it's knowledge first as opposed to knowledge second, right? That is in many of these applications, and we talk a lot about the data layer. But at the very algorithm layer itself, just like the simple example that I gave you earlier, where the teacher, the model itself is knowledge, right? No data involved, maybe some sample data, but for the most part, it's certainly not machine learning type of data. And you can build an algorithm directly for that and then use that to train machine learning. The way I think of it is that is at a layer higher than just the data layer, and then I'll just feed it into the traditional machine learning algorithm. Right. And then combining at the ensembling layer, at the even higher machine learning model with knowledge models and so on in such a way that the system behaves. It's a system view. You and I chatted a little bit about systems engineering and so on. The minute that you actually have to build systems, you realize that in many cases, you have to go to knowledge first, not as an afterthought.
And there's another thing that a misconception is that this whole knowledge first thing only comes into play, or knowledge first is dependent on amount of data. So in other words, if I have small data, yes, knowledge first.
That's a very good point.
But if I have big data, no, I don't need any knowledge at all. But
Right.
in reality, actually, it really depends on your application. So as you point out, if it's like a low stakes application recommending shoes, yeah, maybe you can just go pure big data ML.
Click on the wrong ad or something, right?
Right. So data size is immaterial, right? So it's more context. What is the context of the application?
I would say context goes first. Data size may matter for some simpler context, right? But when you have, human safety, human concerns, it's almost always a requirement, right? And not just from the responsible AI perspective, where you have to trace it back and say which human made this decision, right? For accountability reasons. But essentially, you can't just say, okay, well, I'm just going to throw all this data at it, and then hopefully it doesn't kill anyone. I'm sure Tesla absolutely doesn't do that, right?
So okay, so the second part of our conversation, I wanted to talk to you about this kind of community gathering. So why do you think this is the time to do an event? Which, by the way, for our listeners, you can find more details at the website K1st.World. So why is this the right time to gather this community interested in knowledge first systems?
Well, you're the program chair. You tell me.
No. You're the guest. You're the guest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll share from my perspective, right? Yeah. So we talked about this. We're good friends, and you know what I've been doing recently. But from our personal, our team's context, we were part of Panasonic. We were acquired into Panasonic, and everything that I'm talking about, I'm so passionate about, because these are problems that we actually ran into at a global scale, right, across 200 different projects in this 250,000 person, company. And Panasonic is this global giant in automotive. We mentioned Tesla several times. Panasonic makes all of the Tesla batteries. In avionics, in manufacturing, coal supply chain, and so on. So we're, within that giant, we see this pattern recurring over and over again. And I would be, I'm pretty experienced to know that that's a pretty broad example. We launched out as an independent company last year, April of 2021. and then from there we were able to talk to a lot of other prospects. And the amazing thing was there's so many people kind of searching in the dark, if you will, because a lot of what we talk about is not immediately obvious and even sort of culturally taboo, right? Because again, there's a misunderstanding the minute you say, if I tried to do this, oh, you're doing Boolean logic, you're doing fuzzy logic, you're doing expert systems. And so put another way, we're not the only team that have run into this problem, and in our case, found a solution, building a tool, and so on. But lots and lots of people are running into these walls. Even my friends at Google Cloud AI, I think I could probably say this. The digital in, digital out, Google Cloud AI is very successful at that. But when it comes to the industrial systems, there's lots of challenges. And so there's a team there that is, as you know, the Knowledge First conference, K1st conference. There's a presentation from Google Cloud AI on using human knowledge in parallel with data to train a model, right? So there's lots of examples, and that's just Google. I'm using that as so that many of our listeners that are from the Silicon Valley can empathize. But certainly the Panasonics, the Samsungs, the Hitachis, the Westinghouse of the world,
BASF,
BASF. Yep. If you go to that website K1st.world, you can see all of these people are in a sense searching alone. So I think it's time, and I think you certainly agree. That's why you're the program chair. That it's time to bring this community, birds of the feather, together and say, no, you're authorized to do this. This is the right way to do things, and then we can exchange ideas.
Yeah. So in my experience, having taken part in launching several tech conferences, I think kind of the critical signal is people, as you say, are dying to meet people who have similar problems.
That's right.
And they want to compare notes, but they also want a community where they can kind of just, talk about challenges and possible solutions and things like that. And they feel like that doesn't exist necessarily for this class of problems. So with that said, Chris,
and the benefits of sharing that far outweighs any competitive concerns, at least at the moment.
So with that said, Christopher, in your mind, obviously, so we described like the class of people who are in industrial settings, manufacturing, physical world settings. So who else will benefit from checking out K1st.world?
I think the whole data-centric or data-first community, because you have to see that in the context of knowledge first, and number one, expand your technical view, right? And then quite importantly, how is that being applied by this I call $25 trillion industrial economy? It actually dwarfs what we do here.
There might be things in there, tricks or things in there that they're doing that you might benefit from, even if you're not in that industry.
That is absolutely correct. Yeah, and apply some of your skills and systems to this industry as well, right? One perspective I have is that we've done the easy stuff. Now that's the hard stuff.
Right. And by the way, just to do some humble bragging, we do have some great headliners in the conference.
Well, you invited Rodney Brooks. Maybe you can talk about him a little bit.
So Rodney Brooks is kind of like one of the fathers of modern robotics in many ways, right? So he's started several robotics companies, and he kind of shares this philosophy that machine learning is great, but it really depends on the application you're building, and in some cases that's probably not going to be enough for you. You're going to have to build systems that in our language infuses or captures knowledge, right? So
I think it's no accident coming from one of the world's foremost experts in robotics, right? Meaning touching physical systems. And sometimes he may come off his blog as sort of a cranky old man, right? But that would be a misunderstanding, a misreading of what he's saying, right? In a way, he's saying, hey, expand your perspective, and then the minute you expand it and you touch the physical world, and it's not just bits and bytes, then there are lots of these considerations that come into play that are not simply solved by stuffing a lot of data into the algorithms.
So another speaker who you invited is Janet Wing. So tell us about Janet.
Wow, she's I think I like to refer to her, if people don't understand the significance of the executive VP of research at University of Columbia in New York, then she was she most recently headed Microsoft Research, right? So you and I are both friends of Chi Lu, right?
Yep.
And Chi Lu, I think, is well known in the industry, and Jeanette was on the PhD committee supervising Chi Lu. So so need no further credentials in terms of both academic as well as industry eminence. And I think from that perspective, she's going to talk a lot about, I don't want to frame it incorrectly, but sort of trustworthy AI, responsible AI from an engineer's perspective, right? From a sort of a lifelong computer science person, and really understanding how these systems are put together. I think it's going to be a very exciting keynote from her.
So we can't really do justice to the program in such a short time, but so I encourage you folks to go to K1st.world. But as I mentioned earlier, so part of the goal in a new conference like this is to gather people together and spur conversations. And Christopher and team have set up a program that actually there will be a lot of networking and opportunities to meet some of these speakers, right?
Right. Well, we talked about this and we decided to call it a symposium, right, as opposed to conference. Again, you can look up the dictionary definition, but the idea here, we actually have two sessions, on day one and day two. And of course, there's a technical program, which is very interesting, I believe. But there's also the executive session, and that's where these industry leaders, get together in a very private setting and really share ideas. So when we talk about share, I really mean we should find the forum, create a forum for people to share without any kind of recording devices and so on, and so they can put the guard down and say, okay, these are the problems that I've run into. By the way, there's a retired general from the NSA coming as well.
And we actually also have two really important thought leaders in the area of responsible AI, Raed Ghani of Carnegie Mellon, and also Patrick Hall, who's one of the founders of BNH.ai, the first law firm focused on AI. And they also helped the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, with their framework for managing risk in AI. And if you know anything about NIST, their framework for cybersecurity is the most influential in the cybersecurity space. So there's anticipation that their framework for AI will also be equally influential, and it's already being cited by research groups like Meta.
Right.
And so
I see this as quite an interesting juncture or intersection. We have a lot of these technical conferences that talk about algorithms and advanced architectures and so on. I think that's where you really learn, the most advanced techniques. And then we have quite separately these symposia of policy, and government and industry people, but they talk at a very high level about their concerns and so on. But there's never been an intersection of the two, right? Where all of these discussions are actually grounded by real world applications. In fact, I can't think of the last time I went somewhere and actually learned what BASF or Hitachi is actually doing, right? And their successes and the failures, right? For the most part, you go there and people say, hey, I developed this algorithm and it was successful, right? So that's well and good, but I'd like to know, okay, I'm not here to learn another algorithm, but I'm here to say, how did you revolutionize, or how are you solving the problems of the fishing industry, right? There's a company Furuno that coming and talking about that as well.
Yeah. And as Christopher notes, if you're a technologist working in purely digital settings, there's still a lot for you to learn from people who are working in physical applications and in industrial applications. But also, honestly, even if you're just an entrepreneur, curious about what kinds of problems people have, because startup 101 is you have to build something that actually solves a real problem, right? So
yeah. There's so many opportunities because AI, machine learning, again, Silicon Valley, the digital companies took advantage of it first in many ways because it's easier to do so. I shouldn't say easier, right? But that's now that diffusion is coming to the physical industry, and that's a huge world that many of us, don't spend time thinking about or even trying to go after it. There's lots of interesting startup opportunities there.
Yeah. And with that, thank you, Christopher. And once again, the website of the conference is K1st.world.
Awesome.